and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to have you here at the University of Brasilia for the opening section of the 4th International Workshop of the Structuralist Development Macroeconomics Research Group. To give the welcome for all guests and participants, I call now Professor José Luis Aurelio, the coordinator of Structuralist Development Macroeconomics Research Group. This event counts with the support of the Federal Council of Economics, Regional Council of Economics of the Federal District, and also the National Council for Scientific and Technological Development. Now I call the President of Federal Council of Economics, economist Paulo Dante. Oh, sorry. Forgive me. Have the right to speak.
Okay, good morning for everyone that is here at the Green Auditorium of the Faculty of Economics, Business, Accounting and Public Policies of the University of Brasilia. I have the special pleasure to have today with us my friend, Professor José Antonio Campo. Professor José Antonio Campo was today probably one of the greatest greatest economists of Latin America that will open this first day of our international workshop. The idea of having an international workshop begins in 2021 during the pandemics of COVID-19. The two first issues of our workshop only online because of safety reasons regarding the COVID-19. But last year, 2023, we do our first hybrid event here at the Green Auditorium of the University of Brasilia. And I have the pleasure to see through these 4 years of success of editions of this workshop that the Structuralist Development Macroeconomics Research Group was now consolidated as of probably the main heterodox research group in Brazil and a reference for all Latin America and even for Europe. Now we had more than 40 research from every country of the world. We have researchers from Argentina, from Uruguay, from Brazil, por supuesto, of course, from Mexico, from Colombia, from Spain, from Italy, from United Kingdom, United States, and also so far as India. So I think that we have a very heterogeneous network of researchers, and due to that, the research group is now coordinating a research area in the European Association for Evolutionary Political Economy, which is the second largest association of economists in Europe and the largest heterodox association of economists in Europe. And we are also organizing in the last years a publication, twice a year publication called Development Macroeconomics Bulletin that we just have launched the volume 4, issue 1, on some days ago, that Professor Paula Bustamante from the State University of Montes Claros will make a brief presentation before the lecture of Professor José Antonio Campo. So, in behalf of the Structuralist Development Macroeconomics Research Group, I will welcome all of you that are here present and all people seeing us in our YouTube channel and the YouTube channel of the Federal Council of Economics, people all over the world, from all America, Europe, and even Asia, that are now seeing this beautiful workshop. And I have to acknowledge the full support of the Federal Council of Economics in the person of his president, economist Paulo Dantas, and also the full support of the Regional Council of Economics of Distrito Federal in the person of economist Luciana Scioli. And also, of course, the financial support of the National Council for Scientific and Technological Development of the Ministry of Science and Technology. So welcome, and we will have a very good time together in the next 3 days. Thank you.
Speech, Professor. Now I call the President of Federal Council of Economics, economist Paulo Dantas. President of Regional Council of Economics, Dr. Luciana Scioli. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to be on your...
Camila.
Now I call the Director of ECLAC Office in Brazil, Dr. Camila Grofa. And gentlemen, please, I ask you to be on your feet and hear with respect the national anthem of Brazil.
As plácidas, o povo herói cobrado, retumbante, sol da liberdade em raios fúlgidos, brilhou no céu da pátria nesse instante, e o Senhor, essa igualdade, conseguimos conquistar com braços fortes. Em teu seio, ó liberdade, desafio o próprio. Ó pátria amada, idolatrada, salve, salve. Vai ouvir, flores de esperança, a terra desce. É o risonho em mim, a imagem do cruzeiro resplandece. Da própria natureza, és bela, esporte impávido, colosso. Teu futuro espelha essa grandeza, terra dourada. Tu és do Brasil, ó pátria amada, dos filhos deste sol és mãe, gentil pátria amada. Brasil. É o profundo, mas ó Brasil, florando da América, sol do novo mundo, o que a terra mais garrida, teus risonhos. Nossos bosques têm mais vida, nossa vida no teu seio. Ó pátria amada, idolatrada, salve, salve. Bolo do labaru que ostentas estrelado, ouro desta flâmula, mas no futuro, história no passado. A justiça clava forte, verás que um filho teu não foge à luta, não teme quem te adora a própria morte, terra adorada, entre outras mil és tu, Brasil, ó pátria amada, dos filhos deste sol és mãe, gentil pátria amada, Brasil.
Paulo Dantas has the right to speak.
Um, dois, três.
Bom dia a todas, bom dia a todos. Gostaria de cumprimentar os membros dessa muito qualificada mesa diretiva. Em nome deles, cumprimento todos os participantes deste evento.
Good morning, everyone. I would like to greet the members of the board and, on the behalf of, extend my greetings to all participants of this seminar.
Amado amigo José Luiz Oreiro, Luciana Scioli, Camila Gramsciol, este evento é uma feliz iniciativa da Universidade de Brasília, em parceria com os Conselhos Federal e Regional de Economia. O tema, além de bastante atual, está claramente no centro das preocupações globais. A desindustrialização precoce em países em desenvolvimento tem muitas consequências econômicas.
This event is an initiative of the University of Brasilia in partnership with the Federal and Regional Economics Council. The main topic of this event, that besides being very current, is clearly at the center of global concerns. Premature desindustrialization in developing countries has many economic consequences.
Essas consequências passam pelo menor crescimento econômico, uma vez que a indústria de transformação perde espaço e ela é um importante motor de inovação, produtividade e geração de empregos de qualidade, e com menos empregos de qualidade, a pobreza começa a se mostrar mais forte.
Those consequences include lower economic growth, considering that manufacturing industry loses space, and it's an important driver for innovation, productivity, and good quality job creations. And if we have fewer good quality jobs, poverty shows itself stronger.
Além disso, o mundo vive uma crise climática e, aqui no Brasil, nós acabamos de ver como ela se manifestou no estado do Rio Grande do Sul.
On the top of that, the world is experiencing a climate crisis. And here in Brazil, we have witnessed the way it has manifested at Rio Grande do Sul.
Durante o mês de maio, sobretudo nas 2 primeiras semanas, chuvas intensas na maior parte do estado provocaram inundações, destruindo cidades inteiras e causando muitos danos às infraestruturas existentes e à capacidade produtiva instalada em centenas de municípios. Foram 2,4 milhões de pessoas afetadas, com mais de 400 mil desalojadas e 173 mortes confirmadas.
During the past month, especially in the first 2 weeks of May, intense rains in most of the state has caused floods and destroyed entire cities, and caused serious damage to existing infrastructure and to installed productivity capacity in number of cities. 2.4 million people were affected. More than 400,000 were displaced from their homes, and 173 confirmed deaths.
Custos para reconstruir aquilo que foi destruído pelas enchentes estão estimados em 19 bilhões de reais. Tanto a desindustrialização quanto a crise climática têm o potencial de aumentar a pobreza, sobretudo em países em desenvolvimento.
The cost to rebuild the state are estimated in almost $4 billion. Both desindustrialization and the climate crisis have potential to increase poverty, especially in developing countries.
Hoje somos cerca de 8 bilhões de pessoas no mundo. Segundo um relatório da ONU divulgado em 2022, nos países em desenvolvimento existem mais de 1,2 bilhões de pessoas em situação de pobreza. Deste total, 593 milhões de pessoas não tinham acesso à eletricidade e 437 milhões não têm acesso à água potável e saneamento.
We are about 8 billion people in the world. According to the United Nations report released in 2022, there are more than 1.2 billion people in poverty in developing countries. Of this total, 593 million people do not have access to electricity, and 437 million do not have access to clean water and sanitation.
A intensificação das relações econômicas internacionais, no movimento que ficou conhecido como globalização econômica, representa uma natural expansão proporcionada pela dinâmica capitalista, o que resultou na mutação do objeto da nossa muito amada ciência econômica. Como consequência, passou a ser necessário considerar novos elementos nas novas análises.
The escalation of international economic relations, known as economic globalization, represents a natural expansion guided by capitalism dynamics, which has caused a mutation of the object of our beloved economic science. As a consequence, it became necessary to consider new elements in our analysis.
Em 1993, o fotógrafo sul-americano Kevin Carter fez uma foto histórica no Sudão. Ele retratou uma criança negra, arqueada de cansaço, com debilidade física e fome, à beira da morte, observada por uma ave de rapina, à espera do último suspiro para se banquetear com o que restava de um corpo que integra a estatística da riqueza negativa no mundo global.
In 1993, South African photographer Kevin Carter took a historic photo in Sudan. He took a photo of a black child bent with fatigue, physically debilitated and starving on the brink of death. The child has observed by a vulture, waiting for the last breath to feast on what was left of a body that was part of the negative wealth, statistics, and global world.
Carter fez a foto e afastou a ave. No ano seguinte, ganhou o prêmio Pulitzer, mas entrou num estado depressivo e cometeu suicídio. A criança, cujo nome era Kong Nyon, sobreviveu à fome, mas veio a falecer anos mais tarde, por volta de 2006 ou 2007, de uma enfermidade que os habitantes da aldeia somente conseguiam definir como febre.
Carter took the photo and chased away the vulture. On the following year, he won a Pulitzer Prize, but felt in depressive state and committed suicide. The child, whose name was Kong Nyon, survived hunger, but died a few years later, around 2006 or 2007, of a illness that villages could only define as fever.
Aquela imagem é lembrada como um emblema da miséria. Era uma criança sudanesa, mas poderia ser de qualquer outro país em que há focos de pobreza extrema.
The image is remembered as a symbol of misery. It was a Sudanese child, but it could be any child from any another country where there are people living under extreme poverty.
A questão da fome e da pobreza passou a ser tratada no plano global. Em setembro de 2015, na cidade de Nova York, no encontro dos Estados-membros da Organização das Nações Unidas, líderes de 193 países aprovaram a Agenda 2030 para o Desenvolvimento Sustentável.
Hunger and poverty has come to be discussed on global level. In September 2015, in New York City, at a United Nations member states meeting, leaders of 193 countries approved the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development.
Cabe aqui mencionar com destaque o objetivo 1, acabar com a pobreza em todas as suas formas e em todos os lugares. E o objetivo 2, acabar com a fome, alcançar segurança alimentar e melhoria da nutrição e promover a agricultura sustentável. Para tal finalidade, a mesma Agenda 2030 deixou indicado o esquema de financiamento dos projetos, contando com recursos correspondentes a 0,7% do PIB das grandes nações e com 0,15% a 0,2% do PIB dos países em desenvolvimento.
It's worth mentioning here, goal number 1 of this agenda, to end poverty in all its forms everywhere, and goal number 2, to end hunger, achieve food security, and improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. To this end, the same agenda has indicated the funding of the projects, which include resources corresponding to 0.7% of the GDP of major nations and 0.15 to 0.2 of the GDP of developing countries.
Antes de questionarmos se esses recursos são suficientes, é preciso analisar outro elemento. A solução de problemas como a fome e a miséria tem sido pautada nos recursos ordinários das grandes nações, das quais o mundo faminto necessita e espera uma generosidade que não existe ou nunca existiu e com a qual não se pode contar.
Before questioning whether these resources are sufficient or not, it is necessary to analyze another element. The solution to problems such as hunger and misery has been based on ordinary resources of major nations, from which the hungry world needs and expects a generosity that doesn't exist or has never existed and cannot be relied upon.
Aliás, quando falamos de não poder contar com a generosidade dos países, também devemos levar em conta este comportamento ao falar das políticas climáticas. De acordo com outro relatório da Organização das Nações Unidas, também divulgado em 2022, para evitar os piores efeitos das mudanças climáticas, seria necessário atingir o pico de emissões antes de 2025 e diminuir 43% até 2030. No entanto, os compromissos anunciados de forma voluntária pelos países indicam que as emissões de gases de efeito estufa aumentarão em quase 14% na próxima década.
In fact, when we talk about not being able to count on the generosity of countries, we must also take this behavior into account when talking about climate policies. According to another United Nations report also released in 2022, to avoid the worst effects of climate change, it would be necessary to peak emissions before 2025 and decrease by 43% by 2030. However, the commitments announced voluntarily by countries indicate that greenhouse gas emissions will increase by almost 14% in the next decade.
Em junho de 2020, os economistas Joseph Stiglitz, Thomas Piketty, José Antônio Ocampo, que aqui nos honra com sua presença, e a economista Jayati Grosh, diante da perda de arrecadação dos governos em razão da pandemia de Covid-19, imaginaram o uso de mecanismos tributários mundiais que pudessem alcançar as grandes corporações e oligopólios e as grandes plataformas de provedores digitais que atuam na internet, num contexto de um movimento denominado reforma tributária global.
In June 2020, economists Joseph Stiglitz, Thomas Piketty, José Antônio Ocampo, and Jayati Grosh, in light of loss of government revenues due to COVID-19 pandemic, thought about the use of global tax mechanisms that could reach large corporations and oligopolies, and also large platforms and digital providers operating on the internet. In this context, the movement they called global tax reform.
Em outro momento, em junho de 2021, os ministros de Finanças e presidentes dos bancos centrais do G7 propuseram a criação de um imposto corporativo global incidente sobre o lucro das grandes multinacionais, particularmente das gigantes digitais. No ano de 2023, o ministro da Economia da França, Bruno Le Maire, informou que as negociações no âmbito da Organização para a Cooperação e Desenvolvimento Econômico, a OCDE, estavam bloqueados devido à oposição de vários países.
At another time, in June 21, G7 finance minister and central bank presidents proposed the creation of a global corporate tax on the profits of large multinationals, particularly the big techs. In 2023, the French Minister of Economic, Bruno Le Maire, reported that negotiations with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, were blocked due to the opposition of several countries.
Há poucos dias, a Agenda 2030 voltou a ser discutida em Salvador, na Bahia, em encontro do G20, do qual participaram delegações de 45 países. Na ocasião, o ministro Silvio Almeida, da pasta dos Direitos Humanos e da Cidadania, destacou que as pessoas em situação de rua representam a expressão máxima da desigualdade e da pobreza.
A few days ago, the 2030 agenda was discussed again in Salvador, Bahia, at G20 meeting that counted with delegations for 45 countries. On the occasion, Minister Silvio Almeida from the Ministry of Human Rights and Citizenship emphasized that people living on the streets represent the maximum expression of inequality and poverty.
Fato é que, em 2024, ainda não buscamos alternativas seguras para a solução de problemas tão elementares como a fome e a miséria, que são verdadeiras chagas para os homens e mulheres do nosso tempo. Todos nós, em especial os economistas, temos o dever de indicar novos caminhos através dos quais a humanidade possa trilhar na busca pela solução de problemas tão graves quanto esses que estão aqui mencionados.
The fact is that in 2024, we still have not thought alternatives to solve such elementary problems as hunger and misery, which are true source for the men and women of our time. All of us, as and special economists have the duty to indicate new paths through which humanity can walk in and search for solutions to such serious problems as the ones we have already mentioned.
Tenho defendido a indicação de uma nova governança econômica global, com poderes para a implantação de um tributo incidente sobre o gigantesco fluxo financeiro mundial, modernizando a ideia que foi apresentada ainda na década de 1970 pelo economista norte-americano James Tobin. De acordo com os dados do Banco de Compensações Internacionais, em abril de 2022, foram realizadas operações cambiais diárias da ordem de 7,5 trilhões de dólares. Repita-se, 7,5 trilhões de dólares por dia. Minha tradutora, me perdoe. Vai acrescentar isso aqui. Todos nós que estamos aqui sabemos o que representa 7 trilhões e meio que é movimentado por dia. Nada mais, nada menos de mais de 3 vezes o PIB do Brasil ano. E aí, minha tradutora?
I have been advocating for the indication of a new global economic governance with powers to implement a tax on the giant global financial flow, modernizing the idea presented back in the 1970s by American economist James Tobin. According to the data from the Bank from International Settlements in April 2002, daily foreign exchange operations added up to $7.5 trillion, repeating $7.5 trillion. As the president just said, it's 3 times the GDP of Brazil.
Se aplicada uma alíquota da ordem de 0,1%, haveria uma arrecadação diária de 7,5 bilhões de dólares, ou 1,875 trilhão ao ano, considerando 250 dias de atividade econômica. Essa taxa seria aplicada a todas as transações cambiais, inclusive aquelas realizadas por bancos centrais, e arrecadada pelo sujeito ativo da potencial relação tributária, ou seja, esta nova governança global, que pode ser a própria ONU, ou o FMI, o Banco Mundial.
If a rate of 1% were applied, there would be a daily revenue of $7.5 billion or $1.875 trillion per year, considering the 250 days of economic activity. This tax would be applied to all foreign exchange transactions, including those carried out by central banks and collected by the competent authority in this case. This new global governance could be the United Nations or World Bank or any other.
O valor arrecadado seria aplicado nas nações mais pobres do mundo, nas áreas de educação, saúde, habitação, saneamento, questões climáticas e, principalmente, no combate à fome e à pobreza. Destaque que a tributação proposta não afetaria a livre movimentação de capitais e geraria uma arrecadação completamente fora dos orçamentos nacionais, uma vez que as operações tributadas têm características essencialmente internacionais. Repetindo, recursos fora dos orçamentos nacionais.
The amount collected would be applied to the poorest nations in the world in areas of education, health, housing, sanitation, climate issues, and above all, in the fight against hunger and poverty. It should be noted that the proposed taxation would not affect the free movement of capital and would generate revenue completely outside national budgets, since the taxed operations have international features.
Estas são as considerações que eu gostaria de fazer ao iniciar este evento. Como economistas, todos nós, temos o dever de apresentar soluções que possam mudar o mundo e impactar de forma decisiva a realidade das pessoas, e é o que eu desejo para os debates que serão realizados ao longo deste evento. Muito obrigado a todos.
These are the considerations I would like to make at the beginning of this event. As economists, we have the duty to present solutions that can change the world and decisively impact the reality of people. And that is what I wish for the debates that will take place here. Okay, thank you.
For your speech, now Dr. Luciana Scioli has the right to speak.
Good morning or good afternoon for everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here, participating in the opening session of the fourth international workshop of the Structuralist Macroeconomics of Development Research Group. I would first like to thank Professor Oreiro for inviting me to participate in this opening panel. And I would also like to greet everyone here, my colleagues here in the table, professors, students, and the other distinguished guests. The theme chosen for this year could not be more appropriate. Premature, the industrialization and climate change perspectives for the global North and South. We all know we are living in a time of major redefinition on the global agenda that involves geopolitical issues, change in the international financial architecture, migration, and poverty. Certainly, these changes have different impacts between regions and countries around the world. For us, in the Global South, the problems of the industrialization and financing difficulties to face climate change must be added. For the Federal District Regional Council of Economics, the theme of these workshops is not only important and timely, but it offers the basis for the qualified economic debate on these and other aspects of the sustainable development. Therefore, I believe that this workshop will bring many positive results to academic community as well and organizations in general. Finally, I would like to thank the opportunity, and I take this opportunity to wish you all good work. Thank you very much.
For your speech, now Dr. Camila Rocal has the right to speak.
Morning, bom dia, good morning to you all. It's my immense pleasure to be here with you today. I would like to thank Professor José Luis Oreiro for the invitation and congratulate you on the initiative of organizing this fundamental debate. I would also like to greet Paulo Dantas, the president of COFECON, the Federal Council for Economics, and Luciana Scioli, the president of the Regional Economics Council for the Federal District. I will be very brief. I will briefly discuss on the relevance of this event and why the discussions that will be carried out over the next 3 days are fundamental for Brazil, Latin America, and the world. So we are now at the start of the fourth international workshop of the Structuralist Development Macroeconomics Research Group. And the topic of this fourth international workshop is Premature Deindustrialization and Climate Change, Global North and South Perspectives. Now, the choice of the topic could not be more relevant in our current days, in the current context that we are facing. We are now currently facing dramatic climate disasters in Brazil and in other Latin American countries and worldwide. As Dr. Paulo was saying in his speech, Brazil is currently facing one of its greatest climate tragedies in Rio Grande do Sul, with extreme floodings, loss of lives, and destruction of the economic apparatus that will have long-lasting effects. This event illustrates the types of environmental disasters that we can expect if we do not address climate change. As we are in a structuralist environment, I would like to recall the thoughts of Raul Prebisch, which is one of the founding fathers of CEPAL and the structuralist economic thinking. He has a text from the year 1980 in which he argued that, referring to the environmental crisis, we are not in the face of a new crisis, but we are in the face of a crisis that makes the old crisis more severe. And he was referring to the fact that climate change is a phenomenon that comes to aggravate the structural development gaps that countries face. To give you a couple of examples to illustrate his argument, at the one hand, climate change will exacerbate external vulnerabilities. We know that Latin American peripheral countries in general still face major external vulnerabilities. And one of the sectors that will be most affected by climate change is precisely agricultural commodities. This puts countries that depend heavily on agricultural commodities in a scenario of climate change inaction at ever increased vulnerabilities in terms of its external balance. On the other hand, climate change will also exacerbate poverty. The impacts of climate change are more severely faced by vulnerable communities. These are the communities that inhabit the margins of the rivers subject to floodings, the slopes of the hills subject to landsliding. So these are the communities that will face more severely, and so climate change also tends to aggravate the distribution and the inequality in our countries, in our economies. On the other hand, so speaking of how climate change exacerbates the problems and the developmental gaps in peripheral, in Latin American countries and in Brazil, when we think about what we can do about it, there is perhaps an ultimate window of opportunity for Brazil and for Latin American countries to finally achieve a structural transformation that is more inclusive, that is more productive, but one that is also environmentally sound. This, another way of looking at the problem, so one way is understanding the impacts of inaction, and the other way is understanding the opportunities of actions and understanding how climate action in particular can also deliver developmental objectives and goals. This second perspective on the issue is closely linked to the topic of this event, which is premature deindustrialization. This phenomenon in itself already aggravates, as Professor Paulo Dantas was saying at the beginning, the prospects for economic growth. It decelerates the prospects for economic growth. But in a context of climate action, it also represents lost opportunities. To put it very simply, if assuming, look at Professor Ocampo, please ignore these comments, but assuming that the finance issue is resolved, assuming that now we have all the finance to carry out all the decarbonization investment that is needed in order to achieve the climate goals. In a country such as Brazil, such as Colombia and other Latin American countries, if we do that tomorrow, this means necessarily that we will be financing and conducting investments that are essentially based on foreign technologies. So we are talking about imported electric vehicles, imported solar panels, important wind farms, and so on and so forth. The very link that builds together the climate agenda and the development agenda is productive development. Brazil is perhaps the clearest opportunity or the clearest case of a country that has the conditions to make the low carbon agenda development opportunity as well. This perspective is in essence what we call at CEPAL the big push for sustainability. This is an approach that seeks to identify, at one hand, what are the strategic transformative sectors in which investments should happen. And on the other hand, we look into how to mobilize investments and finance for these investments to occur. And perhaps the distinguishing and structuralist characteristic of the big push in comparison to other proposals and policies that are out there, such as the Green New Deal in the European Union, such as the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. The distinguishing characteristic of the big push for sustainability is that we identify as strategic sectors not just the concentral green sectors, so the investments in renewable energy, the investments in the circular economy, bioeconomy, and so on and so forth. They are fundamental, they are vital, but the distinguishing factor is indeed the importance of investments in productive, technological, and innovation capabilities. So addressing these two topics of this international workshop, premature deindustrialization and climate change, could not be more opportune for Brazil and other peripheral countries, so that we can indeed save the planet from dangerous climate change, but also make this an opportunity for development. I cannot help but also remind and honor the memory of Maria da Conceição Tavares, our esteemed Portuguese-Brazilian economist that was one of the most important women economists in the world, certainly in Latin America, and who gave us perhaps the fundamental legacy of not only building new structuralist economic thinking in Latin America, but most importantly, underlying the importance of thinking of our problems and thinking of our solutions from our own perspective. And in her honor, I am also very honored here today to be in the presence of José Antonio Ocampo, who has a distinguished academic and professional career, and who also was and is a founding father of CEPAL and its modern thinking nowadays. It is based on these fundamental contributions that we at CEPAL still inspire ourselves to build analysis and proposals for the region. Professor José Antonio Ocampo has occupied several leadership positions at the University of Columbia. Okay. Oh, brilliant. So I will introduce Professor Ocampo later on, but at CEPAL, maybe just to finalize our thoughts, I want to reiterate the relevance of the topic of this conference, and later on I'll save my words of introduction for Professor Ocampo. Thank you very much.
Very much for your speech. I kindly ask for all of the people of the opening section to please return to your seats. I now ask Professor Paula Bustamante from the State University of Montes Claros in Minas Gerais to present the new issue of Development Macroeconomics Bulletin, Volume 4, Number 1, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to express my pleasure in participate the fourth international workshop of the Structural Development Macroeconomics Research Group. My name is Paula Caris, and together with Professor Luiz Paulo Rezende, we are the editors of the Journal of Economy and Public Policy of University of Montes Claros. I will read my presentation slowly because my English is very good, not is very good. So, we are going to distribute the folder of the periodic website of the University of Montes Claros. In the QR code, there is the information in English. The Journal Economy and Public Policy, established in 2013, in electronic journal of Department of Economics and Postgraduate at the State University of Montes Claros, Unimontes. In 2020, this university created the website. This presents the special use of this the Development Macroeconomics Bulletin in its sixth edition. This edition features 8 articles distributed across the two thematics, macroeconomics and economic development. About macroeconomics, the authors discuss Kalekian conception of structural heterogeneity and integration of environmental sustainability into macroeconomic structures, the eco-Keynesian cross. About economic development, the authors address the transition process of Eastern European economies. The journal presents a series of studies on Latin America, including rate liberalization in Latin America, the behavior of profit rates and exchange rates in Brazil from 2000 and 2023, the relationships between low export diversification and greenhouse gas emission in Latin America, the impacts of COVID-19 pandemic on the economic situation of Latin American countries, and the Libertarian Stabilization Program and the consequence in Argentina. About visibility of journal. Professor Luiz, please.
Afternoon, the visibility is these special editions making a significant contribution to the debate in the macroeconomic economic development, with particularly attention to challenges faced by Latin America, Eastern European. The contributions, the measures, is visibility, the journal around the world. More information, see code is website maps.
Visitor map for periodics Unimontes This journal, this journal has 1 million, 1,000 accesses. 1,000. Around the world. Acknowledgements. We would like to express our gratitude for the collaboration of the authors and editors of the Development Macroeconomics Bulletin. It is important to highlight that this partnership was made possible by Professor José Luiz Oreiro and Kalinka Martins da Silva, whose dedication and consideration were essential for the success of this edition. Thank you. We also appreciate the support of Unimontes, which facilitates our participation in this event. Contact the Journal of Economics and Public Policy, email, Instagram, e o website of periodicals of Unimontes. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. I kindly ask Professor Paulo Bustamante and Professor Luis Paulo Rezende to return to your seat. Very much. Now I ask Dr. Camila Grocon to make a brief introduction of our special guest, Professor José Antônio Ocampo, please.
Now I have the honor to present Professor José Antônio Ocampo, who we consider a dear friend of CEPAL and of Latin American economic thinking. As I was saying earlier, Professor Ocampo, in our perspective, is one of the pesos pesados of CEPAL, one of the iconic figures and founding fathers, along with Maria da Conceição Tavares, who passed away this last weekend. So I'll try to be brief. The curriculum of Professor Ocampo is very extensive. So Professor José Antônio Ocampo has a distinguished academic and professional career. He occupied positions of leadership at the University of Columbia, at the Government of Colombia, and in multiple international organizations. He founded last year the cooperation platform on tax in Latin America and the Caribbean, PTLAC, which now works with CEPAL as its secretariat. Just earlier this year, we had the last meeting of PTLAC, in which PTLAC expressed its support for Brazil's proposals in the G20 concerning progressive tax reform. Professor Ocampo is one of these special figures because he's not only a designer of a new perspective, of new ways in looking at the economy and providing all of us as his students. I'm sure I can speak on behalf of all of us in this sense. But he has also occupied leadership positions in governments and in international organizations in which he has been leading the implementation of these various proposals and ideas. So he was Minister for Agriculture and Rural Development in Colombia. He occupied the role of Minister of Finance and Public Credit in Colombia twice. in which he led recently in 2022 the tax reform with progressive objectives in Colombia. He was also executive secretary, top authority at CEPAL from 1998 to 2003, during which he led the agenda of macroeconomics for development, fiscal pacts, international cooperation and regional integration, economics, and financing for development. He also took, I will not name everything in his CV, which, as I mentioned, is very extensive, but just to highlight some of his leading roles. He was also Undersecretary for the United Nations Economic and Social Development Agency, DESA, from 2003 to 2007. And he also presided the Committee of ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations, from 2013 to 2021. He has some of the most cited books and articles on the economic history of Latin America and the Caribbean. And today we have the honor of hearing your thoughts and latest work on various of these topics. It's an honor to have you, Professor Ocampo. Thank you very much.
Well, let me start before they thanking Jose Luis for that, for the invitation to be with you today, and Camila for that generous presentation. My career. Let me say, let me actually start also rendering the homage to the memory of Maria Concepcion Tavares. Just learned today that she was Portuguese because I always identify her with Brazil. So, but anyway, both her contribution and that of Celso Furtado were in the origins of Latin American structuralism, which is the school of thought that the PAL, of course, developed. Let me also say another thing, which is, you know, since this is about the structural development macroeconomics, I would say you know, in the 1980s, we launched this new trend of thought called, we call neo-structuralism. And I think one of the issues that we were very strong on is to bring more macroeconomics into structuralism, because the old structuralist school did not have much of macroeconomics. So I think so this issue of development of macroeconomics, and for that reason, we brought into the contributions of what came to be known as the post-Keynesian school. Notably, Kaleski, I see that in the journal that was launched today, there is something on Kaleski, but also John Robinson, Nicholas Kaldor. I mean, that is school of thought that was, of course, part of the tradition of English Keynesian or post-Keynesian, not much the U.S. Keynesian thinking. Most of us were trained, and I think you know, bringing that tradition into structuralism was, I think, a step forward. I'm going to summarize today some of my views on actually on what has happened with the Latin American economy since the market reforms. Then, you know, what are the agenda going forward? So, looking at the trends in market reforms, the first looking at what the reform did in Latin America and what were the outcomes later on. Let me emphasize that some of the features were, fiscal discipline and stronger focus on inflation, which, but still, as we will see, it kept some procyclical policies, in particular in fiscal policies, and unstable real exchange rates, which I think are two problems that we see still in macroeconomic management in Latin America. Now, the structural reforms, trade liberalization, of course, the rule, but together with the dismantling of production sector policies. By the way, I prefer to, at least particularly in Spanish, I guess the word, when you say política industrial in Spanish, you mean manufacturing. And it's not only manufacturing. That's why I prefer, actually, when I was in the head of CEPAL, the term we used at the time was production sector policies. And I see that my current successor is also using the term production sector policy, because it's also, aside from manufacturing, primary goods, agriculture had been a traditional source of production sector policy in several Latin American countries, strongly, for example, in Brazil. But also, the issue, well, mining, I'll talk about mining points today, but also services, which today have to be at the center of any production sector policies, given the prominence of services, even as an international trade. So I think that's why, but let's say the market reform really dismantled most policies in place, not totally, but largely so. And then there was the domestic and external financial liberalization. However, there are also non-standard elements. And in trade, the non-standard element was regional integration. With the birth of Mercosur in 1991, but also the strengthening of the other regional integration processes, particularly the Andean Community and the Central American integration process. But the other non-standard element, which is totally different, let's say, and in a sense in contradiction with the one we're talking, is about free trade agreements. Free trade agreements starting, of course, with NAFTA in 1993, but led by particularly by Mexico and Chile, but later on by now, some of the deviations from the Washington Consensus were the subsistence of several state-owned development and commercial banks. Brazil is actually perhaps the most important example of that trend, but there are many others, including, for example, my country, Colombia, that kept the development banking system in place, and some of the state-owned banks. And then some cases of regulation of capital flows. Brazil, Chile, and Colombia are probably the most countries that have used that instrument several times. And there were diverse models of privatization, particularly, but also the subsistence of many state-owned companies. The most remarkable case is actually oil, where most of the state-owned companies were actually kept. Only actually partly so Bolivia and Peru really privatized. By the way, this is a very interesting issue, even with the Chile, not the case of oil, but with copper. But it's historically, it's interesting that the leader of market reforms, which was Chile in the 1970s, decided to keep the state-owned copper company, Codelco. So some state-owned companies were maintained. Some state-owned companies were maintained, not only in this sector, but in some other sectors too. Another major deviation, as we will see, which was very important, was the expansion of government spending, in particular, the increasing social spending. This was in total contrast with the views that at the time were presented by the World Bank, which was the master of austerity in public sector spending, with a very focus on targeting. But that, as we will see, was not the trend in Latin America. So we ignored the World Bank in that regard, and we decided to. And this is, by the way, for one peculiar reason. Remember that in the 1980s, the debt crisis of Latin America coincided with the return to democracy of many countries. So it was also the decade of democratization of Latin America. And for democratization, social spending was actually crucial. And that's why, that's I sometimes call it the democratic dividend that we got in terms of economic policy. We will see that. And also limited labor market reforms. Anyway, that was another idea that, markets had to be totally liberalized, labor markets. That was not done essentially by any of the countries. Now, what are the effects? The effects, first of all, is very dismal economic performance. The economic growth of Latin America between 1990 and 2023 was 2.5% per year. This is less than half than the 5.5% of 1950-1980. So the industrialization era was much better in terms of economic performance than the market reform era. Now, also mixed with frequent crises, and we will see that, and I'll point out this, what I have come to call the new lost decade of Latin America, which is this 2014-2023. Now, in terms of integration in the world economy, there was a relative success, but that's largely due to Mexico, high levels of foreign direct investment, and also to private external financing, but that has been very unstable. And a source of cyclical shocks, or new cyclical shocks, although not generating something like the debt crisis, which was the beginning of, let's say, of private sector financing of Latin America. Now, inflation was also controlled with two major exceptions called Argentina and Venezuela. So this is the map I have done of the performance of Latin American economies in the industrialization era, and then since 1990. I actually have ranked here countries by how much they have slowed down relative to the industrialization era. And the worst case in the bottom is Brazil. Brazil grew 7% per year in industrialization, and it has grown 2.3% since 1990. But the other is Mexico. So the two largest economies of Latin America, with very different models of market reforms, ended up being the worst performance of Latin America. I have on top the only three economies that have grown actually a bit stronger during the since 1990, which are Chile, Uruguay, and Bolivia. Uruguay, I must say, with poor growth in both periods. But Chile was also very good in the beginning of the market reform, but then it has actually been a slow grower again. And that, you can say that also of Bolivia. Okay? And this is because of the cyclical shocks. This is the annual growth rates. During the industrialization era, there was some, different, volatility, but not. But look at the volatility since 1990. It's amazingly high. With the strong crisis at different times, the associated let's say the East Asian crisis of 1997, which actually became a crisis of its own in Brazil and Argentina later on. Actually, Colombia was also strongly affected by that crisis. But you can see also the negative growth rate in 2009, which was the result of the crisis of the developed countries. We generally call the global financial crisis. but with some other people, we decided to call it the North Atlantic financial crisis for one basic reason. When the crisis takes in developing countries, they have names, Latin America, Asia, but when they take place in the US, they are global. No, that was a financial crisis of the US and Western Europe, North Atlantic financial crisis. Anyway, that was a negative also. And then we have the effects of the collapse of commodity prices in around 2015, and then the COVID, and actually also the recent years. So the frequency of crisis is one of the dramatic reasons why the growth has been so weak. Inflation was brought down. This is my graph of inflation. I obviously use the median to avoid the effects of hyperinflation, so on average. So I use median. But look at that, the 1990, there was a clear decline in inflation rates, and then they stabilized until the recent period of inflation associated to the invasion of Ukraine. Now, openness happened. So both in exports to GDP and imports to GDP, there has been a positive trend. And the share of Latin American world markets has increased, but I must say is very strongly associated with Mexico. If we exclude Mexico, there has been a small increase in the share in world trade, but is not as strong as. By the way, the increase in share in trade of Latin America is a phenomenon that had started before the market reforms. In the 1960s and 1970s, with the promotion of non-traditional exports, in which, of course, there were several successful stories, including Brazil, including Mexico, including Colombia, including Argentina, for example. The reforms have been successful in generating a new export dynamics. That's why, by the way, some other people would decide not to call that period of industrialization import substitution, because aside from export substitution, there was also export promotion of new sectors, and that's why we have called it the state-led industrialization. Foreign direct investment has been high since the later part of the 1990s. Actually, very interesting, the peak coincided with the East Asian crisis, so it moderate the effects of the East Asian crisis, and has remained around 3% of GDP. Even taking into account the remittances, the dividend payments abroad, the trend has been positive, around 1% of GDP. What has been unstable is private financial flows. This is the bond issues. By the way, the best report of financial flows is actually produced by the Washington office of CEPAL, which this data from them. And it's actually an excellent report that they produce frequently, and the data they provide is the best. You can see that there have been strong cycles in private financing. For example, there's an interruption during the North Atlantic financial crisis. There is also an interruption in 2015, 2016, associated to the collapse of commodity prices. There is also a little collapse before the COVID, and a collapse after the invasion of Ukraine because of the effects on world inflation and high interest rates. So it has been a volatile. We'll see also the cost of financing. Now, in social terms, the results actually have been better, which is a contrast, and I think reflects the fact that in social terms, we did not fully follow the Washington consensus. And I think that's one of the good things about what has happened in Latin America in the last 3 decades. Improvements in human development associated to rising social spending. Latin America was well in terms of health by the 1980s, but not in education. So the most important advance has been in education. Now, in terms of inequalities, the inequalities continue to be high, but there was a very good period, which is, let's say, 2002, 2014, more or less, which coincides actually with a period of faster growth, and as we will see, better performance of labor markets. So my point is, in order to have a strong improvement in income distribution and poverty, we have to have good, strong social policies, but also good labor markets. The labor market don't improve, the social indicators in poverty and income inequality do not improve either. So that's why the period 2002-2014, which is a period of good labor market because of good economic performance, and it's also a period of social policies, active social policies, is the best. Sometimes I call the social decade of Latin America because it's, in a sense, it's one of the best in history in terms of income. Okay. You can see here the increase in public sector spending. You see the collapse of public spending during the debt crisis of the 1980s. But after the debt crisis, with different series, you can see the upward trend in public sector spending, which has been reflected in social spending in Latin America. Let's say we used to spend around 8% of GDP. Today, we spend between 11 and 12% of GDP. So it's a very important, and this is reflected in the expansion of many social programs in Latin America. And one of the effects is the human development, which has improved, with this reversal during the COVID, that has not been fully overcome. Actually, because income is not a good performer, America is not a good performer in income, I decided to estimate regularly human development is without income. So only education and health, and it performs better than the average human development, as you can see in the graph. This is also reflected, by the way, in the catching up in terms of human development for Latin America, where you can see in this graph, Latin America, I mean, still behind OECD, but the gap between Latin America and OECD has fallen, In terms of inequality, in terms of poverty, as we will see, there are three different periods. The early phase of the market reforms was bad, so the inequality increased even more. But then in the early 20th century, particularly in 2002 to 2014, income inequality fell in most countries. Actually, the only exception is Costa Rica. Well, you can say Guatemala also, but in all the other countries, income inequality actually fell during that period. But then it stabilized. So there had not been significant improvements in the last 10 years. So in the last decade, the new last decade, there have been no improvement. And this is also reflected in poverty levels. Actually, you can see in 2002, the poverty levels continued to be higher than in 1980. So in poverty, there was not a lost decade. It was a lost quarter century in Latin America. But then you can see during the 2002-2014, the peak reduction in poverty levels, and then stagnation. Three different periods, very clearly different periods. One, with poor social outcomes, since market reform, let's say, until 2002, then the spectacular, the social decade, let's say, where you have improvements in income distribution, in poverty, and then stagnation. Those decades. And why? Because of labor markets. You can see here the labor markets. The first period was a deterioration, a reduction in urban employment, and increase in urban unemployment. Then you have this big decline in unemployment and a big increase in employment, which happens during this period I'm talking about, 2002-2014, and then a reversal partial reversal actually in the industry. So the performance of labor markets, together with active social policy, is why we have this good performance in 2002 to 2014. So the mix of these two have to come together. So I will say in a later slide, you have to improve social inclusion with economic inclusion, because otherwise you don't have the effects in terms of income. And you can say also the fact that the informality continues to be very high, and actually the improvement during the good period was relatively low. So that today we still have a higher informality than we had in 1990. This brings me to my proposals of what should be the agenda of Latin America going forward. And let's say this is the big topics. Let's say. The first one is we have to have active social policy, but with a better symmetry between social and economic inclusion. So it has to be also with improvements in labor market, because otherwise we don't have the strong positive social outcome. The second is, of course, to have overcome the new loss decade. Latin America will show the numbers in a few minutes, which, in my view, requires diversification of the production structures, so very active social production sector policies, with a strong science and technology policy at the center. How bad we are in research and development. Avoid macroeconomic crisis, because which means countercyclical policies, and then how we integrate it into the global commitments. Certainly, one big issue, which is a big complicated issue, is what's going on with the global trade. International trade is a big crisis, and that's why regional integration is an opportunity that we should really. But now, in my view, the most important ingredient has to be depoliticization of integration. Because, I mean, Mercosur has been the worst case, in which politicization has affected Mercosur. And I must say, I'm afraid that due to the current confrontation between Argentina and Brazil in economic policy, anyway, we have to see. As I always say, the poor Uruguay in the middle. The small country in the middle of these two big ones being affected by the different trends in the. So it's actually I respect Uruguay for that reason, because they have been able to manage these two neighbors, which are not complicated neighbors, let's say. But also in the Andean community, Venezuela was a big crisis for the Andean community. Venezuela is back, and we hope it will. And the Central American integration, but the big issue has to be depoliticization. I think this is the big lesson of the European Union. European Union countries continue to be members of the European Union with right-wing governments or left-wing governments. And I think that has to be the rule for the Latin American integration process, and probably to expand. I mean, I hope in the future, I hope to see while I am still alive, the South American integration process. And hopefully the Latin American integration process fully. By the way, at least the South America integrating Mercosur with the Andean community in one process, let's say. Anyway, we have to see that perhaps in the future. Then the international commitments, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals, the climate change, which is the topic I'll talk about, and the protection of biodiversity, which for me is a very important topic. Brazil and Colombia are some of the mega diverse countries of the world. Brazil #2, Colombia #4. So it's a big issue also that we have to be in the agenda. By the way, little talk about biodiversity and related to climate change, but the two are very important, and the world is much worse in terms of biodiversity than in fact. And last but not least, I'm not going to talk about a strong commitment to democratic institutions, according today in Latin America. Anyway, so in social inclusion, what I think has to be done is universal social policies. This is a big topic, by the way, when I was the head of CEPAL. The report that we did for the turn of the century, the 2000 report, Equity, Development, and Security. But the basic point that we emphasized at the time, given the talk about targeting, that was the tone of the World Bank in particular, and the Washington Consensus, we said no, universal social policy. We have to adopt with of course support to the poor to integrate to the universal policy, but the universal policy has to be universal. That's the model that was developed particularly by Europe, Western Europe, and it has been a successful model. So as I wrote at the time, targeting has to be an instrument of universal policies, not the alternative to universal policy. A big topic. So universal policies have to be. But it's essential to make this with better employment conditions. As we will see, only when the two coincide do we have a real good social outcome. Targeted policies can help, but they generally generate a secondary effect. One basic problem, as I'll show, is the issue of progressive taxation, which is a topic in which we are not, as well as the quality of services, which is a topic that is in the agenda, both education and health. This is just a graph from a research I did a few years ago, showing what is the relation between the redistribution, the Gini coefficient generated by the redistribution due to social policies, and human development, which is an indicator of how universal social policies are. And it's quite clear the relation between them. So the countries that are best in terms of redistribution of social spending are, as you can see at the bottom, Costa Rica, Uruguay, Chile, and Argentina, because they do have the more universal policies. Colombia and Brazil are together there with following, but you have also bad examples, including Mexico, by the way. That's a topic that also the Central American countries. And this is the residual effect of fiscal policy, which is very limited in Latin America, and a residual effect of tax policy. This comparison that has been done by many of Latin America versus the OECD is quite remarkable, because you can see in the OECD, the Gini coefficient is 0.28, but that's because of the effects of fiscal policy. I mean, 0.04 is due to taxes, to the restricted taxation, and 0.13 due to the restricted spending. So that's why it falls from 0.45 to 0.28. In Latin America, it hardly falls. There's a little through spending and almost nothing to taxation. In both areas, there can be improvement, particularly because Latin America is much more unequal on average than the average of the world. Economic challenges. Latin America has to overcome the second lost decade. And for me, the major problem associated to that lost decade, but also to the long-term slow growth in the market reform, is deindustrialization, or as the literature says, or premature deindustrialization. The major problem by almost all Latin American countries, South America being particularly critical. So the challenge is we have to reindustrialize, but also with broader production sector policies, because since we are rich in natural resources, how we exploit the natural resources is very important, including how you develop value chains associated to natural resources. So let me put it this way: it's not only lithium or copper. the value chains of lithium and copper. Actually, in copper, for example, because of Chile, we are very advanced, but lithium is just starting, and the possibilities of just being exporters of lithium as a natural resource and not as an industrial good using lithium and then modern services. How do we integrate into the new services associated to the technological revolutions we are living through? Now, for that, horizontal policies are necessary, but also sectorial policies with a critical element for me, which is science and technology. Area in which Latin America, falls very badly behind. In terms of production sectors, we should not forget about competitiveness, which was the topic of the Washington Consensus ideology, but also about real production sector policy. And as I said, the basic ingredients have to be innovation, increasing technological contents, but also new business practices, complementarities, so value chains, how do we link some firms with others, technological activities and tasks, and internationalization. But don't forget the opportunities of domestic and regional markets, particularly in a context in which international trade is not very dynamic as we were saying. So we have two horizontal instruments: education, infrastructures, general science and technology, financing, very important, with the national development banks being an important player, but also selective strategies, promote new activities. When I write about this, it's not about picking winners, it's about building up winners. And the critic has already known, picking winners, and many of some losers. No, it's actually building up how we build up winners. I think that has to be the strategy that we do. And that together with the competitiveness of existing industries, which we have to actually even to promote again, even very traditional ones. Let's say, for example, let's say in my country, apparel. Colombia is actually quite good in apparel production. So that should be a basic idea of a new production sector strategy. How do we improve on that, and we get into the international market for new apparel, which Colombia does participate partly in the world market. Okay, and that add value to existing export activities, which for me the crucial issue is natural resources. So how we have good opportunities in food production, in critical minerals, and how we develop the value chains associated to those sectors. So this is the story of the last decade. The second last decade, you can see 2014-2023, the Latin America grew 0.9% versus 2% during the decade of the last decade. In per capita terms, it's a bit better because of the reduction in population growth. By the way, this is remarkable that the growth rate of Latin America in the last 10 years has been lower than the last decade. And when you see countries, it's very diverse. I actually excluded Venezuela from this graph. I don't know if you are very conscious of that, but Venezuela is 1/3 of the economy. It's the worst collapse. Actually, very interesting. I used to have a friend from Zimbabwe a few years ago. We discussed which was going to be worse, Zimbabwe or Venezuela, in terms of collapse of GDP in peace times. And actually, Venezuela won by a wide margin. Like the worst case of a collapse of an economy in peacetime. There are, of course, collapses in wartime of many economies, but that's not the story. I have to exclude because Venezuela is more than, graph is minus 11% per year. But the other bad case is Argentina, negative, minus 0.2 in the decade. But look at that, Brazil is the next one. So Brazil is one of the worst economies in the last decade. So how you overcome this problem in Brazil? And actually, we were also saw in 1990. So it's a very important. But actually, interestingly, it's the small economies that do better in Latin America. You see the Dominican Republic, Panama, Nicaragua, Honduras, Central America generally does better. I mean, which is a remarkable case because Mexico does not. Mexico does 1.1%. So if you want to integrate with the US, small economies do better than Mexico. That's interesting. Anyway. And the basic reason for the long decline is this premature deindustrialization. The data of ECLAS, the file that I have built up, three different series and trying to make it a decent graph. And what is remarkable is that in recent years, we are back to the 1950s, to the early 1950s. So the whole industrialization that took place between 1950 and the mid-1970s has been totally reversed. By the way, when you look country by country, there are a couple of Central American exceptions, but increasingly not Mexico. Mexico actually did increase the share of manufacturing GDP in the 1990s, but then it has also been declining in Mexico. It's remarkable that not even Mexico is an industrializing economy. And one of the basic reasons is the technological gap and the very little investments in science and technology. On average, let's say Latin America invests 0.6% of GDP, according to this data from UNESCO, which is about 1/4 of what an OECD country on average invests, or almost 1/4 of what China invests. Look at the increase in China. Okay, amazing. And of course, let's not compare ourselves with Israel and Korea, which invest more than 4% of GDP. In Latin America, the only country that invests more than 1%, but is also far behind, is Brazil. But look at the others. As I said in my lectures on Colombia, this is shameful. How little Latin America invests in science and technology. Okay? So that has to be, how you develop science and technology with the private sector, the university system, or the research centers. It has to be a really major priority in terms of. In macroeconomics, I would say, generally speaking, monetary policy has been moving in the countercyclical direction, not quite fiscal policy. Exchange rates are very volatile. And I think this is a major problem, particularly you want to develop new sectors for the world market. Anyway, and the major challenges ahead are fiscal, on the one hand, but also the volatility of capital flows. And for that reason, as I have been doing research in recent years, we need multilateral financing to be very active. Multilateral development bank. So this is the monetary policy of the 5 central banks that use the interest rate as a policy instrument. More or less, they are countercyclical. By the way, with some exceptions. For example, in recent years, the best example of countercyclical, that means reduction in interest rates as inflation falls, they have been Chile and Peru. Colombia in the middle, and the worst cases are Brazil and Mexico. So Brazil and Mexico ended up having the highest real monetary interest rate among these countries. Colombia is in the middle in that pattern. So you wonder why. Brazil has always had very high real interest rate, by the way. I mean, it's a problem that you have to manage here, and it's probably part of the story of growth also. Okay. Fiscal policy, not quite. You can say, for example, in the period, here in the period 2010, 2014, in which Latin America was growing very well, the America should have improved the fiscal policy. They deteriorated a bit. And then in the following period of slow growth, after 2015, we should have had more deficits. So, that's a countercyclical fiscal policy. Well, we did not do that. And so the fiscal policy is basically neutral, essentially neutral, as we can see here. And of course, the major problem is the strong cycle of government debt, which is in this graph, with two peaks, one after the North Atlantic financial crisis, and the COVID. But the levels of government debt continue to be very high, and how to manage this is a major problem for many countries. Brazil is actually among the 5 countries I just mentioned, the worst. Very high public sector debt levels, and high fiscal debts. Now, the exchange rate is, in my view, unstable. It basically follows the external cycle. So appreciation during booms, depreciation during crisis. What you show here. So you have the depreciation in 1997, then the appreciation, excuse me, then the depreciation during the North Atlantic crisis, appreciation during the period of commodity price booms that coincided with fast growth, depreciation after the commodity prices fell. Now, you can say, yes, that should be part of the pattern, but maybe the instability is not good, particularly for the promotion of new sectors for the world markets. So you have more stable or alternative instruments of promoting non-traditional exports. And the volatility of financing, but also the cost of financing. Now, the cost of financing, the trend has been good. Okay. But and actually, very interestingly here, the crises have been shorter. You can see it starts with 1998, that is with the Asian crisis, and we have 5 years of very high, bond yields for Latin American bonds. Then there was a positive trend, which ends more or less in 2014, as many indicators. But look at two interesting things, however, is that the North Atlantic financial crisis of 2008-2009, there was an increase, but it was a very short one. And in COVID, later on, the effect was very short. So I think, this improvement in that regard, in terms of access to international financial markets. But now, the recent period is a period in which the high interest rates of the U.S. Have affected the cost of financing for Latin America. Trade challenges. Latin America should continue to be increasing exports, but particularly reverse the reprimarization of exports that has taken place, particularly in South America. And this is important, particularly in our trade with China. Our trade partner with China is 19th century. For commodities, import manufacturers. Has to change. We have to have a trade pattern with that. Now, regional integration here plays a very important role and should be at the center of the new trends. And I say science and technology and migration and finance should be additional areas in which we have a strong regional integration. By the way, one in which we do have some positive effects is finance, particularly because of CAF. That's the Andean Bank transforming to Latin American Bank. Actually, it's going to be the most important multilateral development bank because it's growing faster than the Inter-American Development Bank. So that's one particular. We have not been quite equally with the FLAR, with the Latin American Reserve Fund, which continues to be essentially Andean. Other countries, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Costa Rica being members of. Now, use the opportunities. What are the opportunities for Latin America? Nearshoring, particularly for the northern part of the region. Food and transition minerals for many economies, and the rapid expansion in services. but the prospects of global trade do not look good. And for that reason, regional integration, in my view, has to be a clear priority. So this is the reprimarization of Latin American exports. So the red and blue are natural resources. The red and yellow, and the blues are manufactures. So the trend was a very positive one of diversification into manufacturers until the end of the 20th century. This is a pattern that, if you look back, had started in the 1970s. But it has been reversed, and natural resources became very important in the 21st century. Now, when you look by groups of countries, the pattern is quite diverse. So the most diversified are actually the exports to the US, but that's because of Mexico. Okay, so that's the market that gets more manufacturing exports from Latin America. But then follows Latin America itself. So regional integration is good for diversification. For Latin American trade, a bit more than half is manufacturers. But now look at the other countries, look at China. China is natural resources. Little, less than 10%, well, a bit more than 10% is manufacturing. And look at the top. The high-tech manufacturers, ridiculously low. Actually, you go back to the old graph, look at that, it's very low, 10% or, So that's the blue, dark blue is the area that we have to bet in the case of that. Integration, very poorly. We can see a bit in the 1990s, but particularly in 2002 to 2010, 12. But then look at that. In the 2011, 2012, the process of integration has actually fallen. Mercosur is essential part of this story. Also, of course, Mexico, Venezuela. I always say to the Mexicans, you have to integrate with Latin America, not with the US. Big problem with Mexico. Not bet on being part of Latin American trade. Now, opportunities, commodities. You see here the food and metals are the best in terms of performance. I compare the commodity prices in 2023 with the average of 2011, 2013, which is the peak of the commodity boom, and with 2019. And I said food and metals are an opportunity. So that's and you see the two metals are actually climate change. I mean, lithium, copper, nickel, are some of the best performance in the metal. Now, trade is bad. This is my story of what happened in trade since the Second World War. We have two booms, 1950, 1974, and 1980 something. I cannot see the 2007. But I think they were very interesting. The middle one, which is one day, I say, why the hell the breaking point between the second and the third? And it was oil prices. So the slow growth in the middle is because of high oil prices in international markets. So now, since the North Atlantic financial crisis, the rapid growth of trade that has happened in this second globalization, let's say, has been very poor. And the growth of export volumes has only been 3% per year, the worst in the post-war era. But if you look at recent years, it's even worse. It's the monthly data on the world exports. And you can see basically since 2021, world trade has stagnated, falling in value terms. So when we think of opportunities for world trade, we have to be cautious of where we're betting. And very importantly, we have to look else. We have to look at our markets, domestic markets and regional markets, as opportunities for international. And I end up with this. This is not my topic, but topic. I did a bit of my job, of course, I start with the fact that the global targets are not being met. I mean, the chance of them not being met is very high. Latin America is actually an intermediate case in greenhouse gas emissions, but for the region, the two important issues are adaptation, one, and stop deforestation. Because our major contribution to climate change is deforestation. Therefore, that has to be a major challenge. And of course, for that purpose, the Amazon is the most important priority. Not the only priority, by the way. So I think the new agreement on the Amazon that was finally written, signed by the government of Brazil, step forward, but it has to be very active in that regard. But there are other regions, and one that is particularly important is the Pacific coast, the North Pacific coast, particularly between Ecuador and Panama, which is a very important forest region, among other reasons because it's one of the most one of the richest forests in biodiversity. But that has to be also a major priority. I was Minister of Finance recently, and I heard in all the World Bank, the banks of World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank about, issue. They always forget the Pacific coast. Don't forget the Pacific coast. Anyway, and the importance of both the Amazon and the Pacific coast is also biodiversity, because Latin America has 6 of the 17 mega diverse countries of the world. So it's a very important issue. Brazil being number 2, Colombia being number 4, but we have Mexico also in the list, Peru, Ecuador. So it has to be a significant priority also in the policy going forward. Now, opportunities. We do have in this the transition minerals, but also the fact that many regions of Latin America reach a rich environment for solar and wind energy. And therefore, if we develop those energies, there is even a possibility of Latin America being a producer of energy-intensive products. One of the alternative, opportunities going forward. Now, a major challenge is what the hell do we do with oil and coal? Coal, in my view, we should try to forget about it. Colombia is, of course, the most important case in terms of coal export. But the issue of oil is an important one. What do we do with the countries, but not only the countries, the regions that depend? There's opportunities for them, has to be a priority in the fight against climate change. Policy instruments, regulations, market for emissions, maybe we should promote the international market, taxes or minimal carbon prices, the promotion and dissemination of technology. This has been an important issue in the international debates. Why the hell do not eliminate property rights on some of the environmental technology? Financing. Financing has to be a real priority here. In a sense, together with technology, the sectors, is technology for financing as the two big issues. Because the financing needs are very large and very insufficient. The UN has also promoted that half of the financing has to be for adaptation. And therefore, the role here for multilateral development banks, as well as national development banks. First, because I did work on those issues. Here, the per capita emissions of CO2. I said Latin America is in the middle between the dark ones, which are the developed basically, and the light ones, which is basically sub-Saharan Africa, which are the low emitters of CO2. Now, the financing, this is based on paper, on work by CEPAL, actually, by Titelman doing a review of the literature. And I said the estimates are very diverse, but let's say it's 3% of GDP or more, probably much more than 3% of GDP in terms of new investment, which is very important, very high, given the relatively low share of investment in Latin America, and includes infrastructure, of different forms, but also many issues associated to water management, which is going to become a very important issue also in infrastructure. This is what the data that I have on this is my work on multilateral development banks, which shows that the most important finance actually is for sub-Saharan Africa, but Latin America and Caribbean follows. But the proportion of adaptation is a bit more than 50% only for sub-Saharan Africa. For Latin America is much less than that. So the improvements in financing of adaptation has to be a priority. Thanks. And also by national banks. This is the estimate that we did with CEPAL, actually a paper I wrote with Titelman on Latin American trend. And this is the multilateral banks or the multilateral institutions are contributing, in a significant way to the financing of climate change, but the national development banks are far behind. Therefore, there has to be a major priority of all the national development banks, but of course, as I pointed out, also for the multilateral institutions. So with this, I end. Thank you again, Jose Luis, for the invitation. Thanks to all of you.
Very much, Professor. This was very enlightening. We had a master class today of economic, social, and environmental development in Latin America. I would not try to summarize your extensive lecture, but I can't help but to highlight a few the topics that we have heard today. So again, Professor Ocampo, with his majesty, walked us through the economic panorama of the region in relation to the global context. We saw the trends on how we are doing in terms of economic growth, inflation, trade openness. We saw a panorama also on how we're doing in terms of social aspects, social policies. Also in terms of trade, and we got the chance to also hear firsthand some of the professors' recommendations on what we can do in each of those areas. Again, I would not try to summarize, but some of the things that caught my attention and that I would like to emphasize very briefly. First of all, is that although very fragile, to say the least, economic performance has been observed over the last recent decades. We did see an improve in social dimension, but there are some persistent structural gaps, especially in terms of informality levels. And although there has been improvement in income distribution and the reduction of the gap of the distribution in countries, we do see that the region remains with a persistently high level of inequality. It's still one of the most unequal regions in the world. In terms of the recommendations, very briefly, what stood out was the necessity to overcome the new lost decades. This is a very sad scenario, a very sad panorama, but it necessarily goes through what the professor mentioned about depoliticization, about regional integration, about maintaining social policies universal, the need of improving or enhancing the work of the countries in progressive taxation, fiscal redistribution. But essentially linking to the topic of this workshop and what will be discussed over the course of the next 3 days, the professor highlighted and illustrated the importance of reindustrialization, the need to advance the development on value chains, and in the context of climate change and the low carbon transition, looking at reindustrialization not just from the perspective of the region being a provider of green commodities, such as lithium and copper, but actually as an opportunity of developing the productive sector, reindustrializing and preparing the region not only to be able to provide answers and solutions for itself, recalling again of Conceição, the import substitution, but also as an opportunity of looking abroad, of promoting exports, internationalization, and innovation. He mentioned a very provocative term about building up winners instead of picking winners, which speaks directly to the context that the region is facing. I will not have the chance to go through everything, but I'm very glad that this lecture is recorded so that we can all rewatch it, because it was very rich, not just in terms of the spectrum of topics that would cover, but also in terms of the evidence provided with data, figures, graphs that help illustrate the challenges ahead of us. So thank you very much, Professor. Again, it's an honor to have you, and thank you again for your keynote lecture that kicks off the workshop. And to end my intervention, on behalf of the organizers, I have a couple of messages to convey. The first is that due to the advanced time that we have, we will not have time to questions at the moment. And the second is that all of those that have been invited for the lunch with Professor Ocampo by the organizers should direct themselves directly after this opening session to the restaurant that has been informed. Again, thank you very much, Professor. It's always a pleasure, and it's always a learning process hearing from you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for your attention and participation, but now this section is ended. We will return at 4 p.m. for a special section on economics and geopolitics sponsored by Equilibrium Consultoria. Have a nice lunch and thank you very much.